Welcome to the Family Skeptical, Parenting Through Nonbelief.
We're a married atheist couple raising two wonderful, strange children. We ask big questions, dissect weird parenting beliefs, and examine how society ignores or misrepresents families like ours. If you're any stripe of non-believer who's involved in raising children, welcome. You are our people.
Our kids have heard all our swears, but yours might not have. So be thoughtful if there are young people listening with you. Pops.
Moms.
We might sound strange on this recording because I believe we were both...
I'm eating fudge. Oh, you had something else you were going to say?
I'm
eating fudge.
No,
like at the moment.
I was thinking about the fact that we are both in different stages of upper respiratory illnesses. So if we're more nasally than normal, apologies. But I had something I wanted to briefly discuss because it's been kind of interesting in our household. So I think we've talked before about how it's sort of one of the banes of my existence, finding books that Reader actually likes to read.
Yes.
And we just went through like an interesting stretch of time because Reader is definitely a kid. I mean, he chose Reader as his name, and he does love to read, which is amazing. And we are so lucky to have that. But he's got very distinct categories of things that he will read, and it can be difficult to decipher. So he has been definitely leaning towards graphic novels of late, which is fine. I love graphic novels. They are amazing. At some point, I will get the kids to read Understanding Comics with me, which is this like amazing dialectical breakdown of comics as a form of art. So that is cool. And we are in an amazing time of like just wildly wonderful graphic novels for kids. So that is super cool. But he had been pushing back a lot on things other than graphic novels. And then at some point after the holidays, he had gotten quite a few novels for the holidays. He did a hard, just like, I will not read novels anymore. And like, it was a really hard moment as a parent for me, because I love books so much. And it just brought up sort of so many anxieties that I couldn't even put into words at the time. And they're sort of all the traditional ones, but I was talking with my mom a little while after this had come up. And I realized that I think the biggest thing is that Reader is just turning into such a cool kid. Like, he is such a good companion at art museums because he has very insightful things to say about art, and he can really look at a piece and have like an emotional and intellectual reaction to it, which is all his own and so interesting. And so beyond just the like, oh man, is this going to cause him problems at school? And like all those sort of classic parental thoughts. I think like more deeply than that was just like, but he is having such cool ideas at this point in his life. And I just wanted books to be able to be part of that kind of soup for him right now that he's floating in. Cause they have so many interesting things that could add to that. So I was really struggling And I'm sure this is something other parents have been through. It was interesting how we worked through it. But when that was all going on, like, you were very helpful. And I am wondering if you wanted to talk about what you were thinking at the time.
I don't remember how I was helpful. I'm flattered.
Well, I know,
but
you
I
said,
honestly can't put my finger on what it was exactly that you're referring to.
well, you told me you went through a similar phase.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I credit comic books with helping to make me love turning pages and broadening my vocabulary and sparking my imagination. And say what you want about comic books. Like, what a person gets, it's like anything that we would apply our skepticism to. You look at what a person can get from the experience, how a person can benefit. And, what I benefited, or how I benefited from exploring reading through comic books, was that I actually fell in love with reading, period. And so I understand, I completely sympathize with any concerns you would have about readers' academics or him missing out on enrichment opportunities, right?
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I think the most important thing is that he is picking up a book. He is opening the pages and he is excited. And that is really all that matters. Because I read like nonfiction and philosophy and fiction and comic books, and like I'll read anything now. But there was a time when I would primarily read comic books because that's what interested me. My parents didn't push. Then I eventually found my way to reading more fantasy and sci-fi, and stuff that was way above my pay grade at that age. But I was able to because of the sorts of stories and the sorts of language and vocabulary I had been exposed to through comic books. So I was reading, Dune and Foundation at a relatively young age, I would say, because comic books conditioned me to be able to digest stories like that with jargon and putting that sort of thing into context and being able to visualize maybe what they're talking about. Then if I had not and had entered into trying to read those books, having only read Where the Red Fern Grows or whatever, I really don't think it's a bad thing. And I just value him seeing the printed page, lifting it, digesting it, and enjoying it, regardless of what's on it, how many pictures there are or whatever. Because like you said, he's great at museums. Part of that is him appreciating visual media.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, as a fan of graphic novels, there are so many artists and creators and, writers who work with artists, and then full graphic novel creators who do their own art and write, where the visuals are so tied in to the narrative. It's not just taking the place of the words. It's evoking something that would be maybe even hard to put into words, and to you sort of giving a shape to somebody else's visual imagination for a visual kid like Reader is, I think has been huge. Like that, I would say video games go into the same sort of box where he loves, like Titanfall 2, for instance, or God of War, where games where he really connects to the narrative, or even something like Ori, or Braid, where the narrative is more abstract. He connects to the art in the way that I think that the creators would have hoped. And so, with that, I'd say graphic novels and comic books are a great fit for him right now, or perhaps for the rest of his life, because that's just how his mind works. I'm not going to begrudge him that. I'm not going to worry about it. Just so long as, when he's required to pick up a book for school, he can do so effectively. And I think that he'll be able to do that because he hasn't shown that he won't be able to.
I'm glad we talked about this again, because one thing I do love about graphic novels, which I think you've more or less said, is that I think kids can read above their pay grade often. Mm-hmm. Because you can get a graphic novel that has some words that you may not understand, that may be more difficult than you're normally dealing with. But because you have the pictures to support you, it's easier to figure out what's going on and kind of
and invented
through.
Language too.
Yeah.
Like, the right, especially like in superhero in hero books, you'll invent names for planets and doodads and heroes and villains. And you start to see how the writers play with language. And through context, you understand what their intent is, what the meaning is, to the point where then you can read hard sci-fi and you come across a word that the writer invented and you get it.
Yeah.
And you don't need a lot of hand-holding, even at a younger age. I think there's something that needs to be addressed there. I might not have even addressed it well enough, but I really do think that comic books are more than a crutch. I think that they can be a big asset to a young reader.
Well, and I'm intrigued because I think one of the other things I was worried about is just, and I truly love graphic novels and the art is so wonderful, but I think I had a worry that like solely reading that, it wouldn't flex that part of his brain where like you have to make up the image yourself. Mm-hmm. But you totally saying that it helped you picture things as you started reading novels, I think is something I wouldn't necessarily have considered.
Well, take Dune, for instance. Okay. Dune has a very, setting aside David Lynch's vision, Dune has a very sort of brutalist, somewhat almost steampunky vibe, wherein, for those of you who don't know the story, artificial intelligences, computers basically were outlawed many, like thousands of years ago before the beginning of this story, because there was a machine rebellion. I believe it's the Butlerian Jihad. And after that, there was a prohibition on thinking machines. And so the sorts of devices that people use might seem fantastical or almost magical in their application or their capability, but they aren't technology necessarily in the way that we would view like cutting edge technology. Everything feels more tactile, where the person is doing the thinking about how it's being used and not, an intelligence programmed into the machine that helps guide your actions. And because of all of the Silver Age Marvel stuff and DC stuff that I had read, I'm thinking specifically about like Jack Kirby, whose art style you moms would identify even not knowing that's the name of the dude who's making it. Mm-hmm. It's very distinctive. And that sort of broad aesthetic is what I put into how I envisioned Dune, where the technology and the architecture and people's interfaces with their daily lives were necessarily really stilted, but also very, I'm speaking with my hands, you can't see it, but very like tactile. And I wouldn't have had, I think, such a strong visual sense of what I saw in Dune, from the sandworms to the navigators and the guild ships to like any of the Ixian technology, is really just comes down to me seeing so many different art styles over the years leading up to that point from different era of comics history to like the really technically detailed stuff of the 80s and 90s through, Chris Claremont's X-Men era up into, the Jim Lee X-Men era. Just there's a lot to be said for having the words and the story paired with somebody's artistic vision. Just like you wouldn't say to, a watercolorist, oh yeah, don't go to the Met because it's going to ruin your vision, right? Like we wouldn't say that to a visual artist of any medium, because that person would have probably spent countless hours poring over, Phaedon books or going to galleries around the world and with a sketchbook and like trying to copy or being inspired by. I don't think there's one path to success here. And I think that, seeing how somebody would pair the visual side to the words is no less important than seeing somebody pair the words to an adapted screenplay or pair the visuals to a poem. I just think it's just expression, and it's either effective or it's not. And that's up to the subjectivity of the recipient, right? So what you value is what you're going to attach to. And so he might start reading Saga and be like, it's okay. And you're like pulling your hair out like, oh my gosh, how could you just say it's okay? I think it's all in the same box, my love. And I think that I can't wait to see what on our like copious graphic novel selection they start to pick through as they get older, because we have a lot of variety.
And just if people were curious, the way we ended up sort of working through the like hard no on novels, he had actually been reading a series and seemed to really enjoy it and had sort of just stopped midway, which I found intriguing.
Yes.
And so we talked about it, and
we can say what it is, right?
Oh yeah.
Trapped in a video game.
Yeah. Trapped in a video game.
Which is like right up his alley.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the kid who fancies himself like maybe someday becoming a game designer. Like Trapped in a Video Game should have been completed like lickety split, because he sprints through books when he likes them. Yeah. He loves to read when he's engaged.
And we talked about it a little bit, and he said he had gotten to a book where it was hard to understand. And one night I kind of tried to force him to read it out loud to me, and that went very badly, unsurprisingly. But we found another time where he was just sort of like in the mood, and he ended up reading it to me, and he didn't have any trouble understanding it. And actually, Reader was the one who said, this is easier when I read it out loud. And I was like, well, that's great. Like, read out loud. There's no rules about how you have to do this. And that was a good discovery. I also think I've just seen it with other things. Like, I think he just, because it's like he loves Legos, but he's had some like Lego projects that he just hasn't wanted to do. And it was the same with puzzles. Like, he loves puzzles, and we had one going, and he just sort of was like not really thrilled to work on it. And then we started again this weekend, and he's done an amazing job. So I think even beyond that, it was just sort of I think he just, I can't really put it into words, but I sort of see him having, I don't know if it's a hard time getting back into things. I don't know. It's just sort of a intriguing thing I'm looking at, but I think now I'm seeing it less as a thing about books in particular and more kind of a thing about just projects for him. Mm-hmm. So.
Oh, he's the same with video games. Like he will do something with great intensity, and then he will drop it, but he will usually circle back.
Yeah.
Which is not always the case with kids. They won't always circle back, but he usually does circle back, which is really interesting.
So I think I'm learning.
It's something I've been talking to him about it, honestly. Like, it's,
but I feel like I'm learning more about him. In thinking about this, which is
I'm impressed. That's really good that you have an open mind about your experience with him, because it's so easy to get upset, like you said in the beginning of this segment, like how easy it is to get upset at yourself. Like, have I failed? Because I love doing this thing. I know its value. He doesn't value it. Oh my gosh, what am I doing wrong?
Yeah.
Sort of
and
thing.
then, since we're talking about books, I just have to tell a librarian story, because librarians are the best.
Salt of the earth.
Salt of the earth. And Go got to experience it firsthand. So,
oh yes. Oh, this is a good story. Yeah.
So this weekend, Go,
gosh,
just,
this kid,
like,
he gets a bee in his bonnet. Man.
He'll just,
he's so like, surly.
Nothing is right, basically.
No.
So we, Reader had a book on hold at the library, and we had another one we had to return. So, and you needed time to cook. So I wanted the kids to come to the library with me, and Go just like did not want to go. But I eventually got him out of the house, and we were heading to the library, and he's like, I'll only be happy if they have a book about humans fighting aliens and robots in space, preferably on the moon. And it can't be a kid one, because those always have bad endings. So it has to be one for older readers. And that's the only way I'll be happy. And in the back of my mind, I'm like, we're not going to find this book, but like, maybe, but like, hope he actually likes a wide variety of things. So I was just like, oh, I hope like something excites him, right? So we get to the library and go in and find Reader's book, and I'd asked Go if he wanted me to ask the librarians, and he was like, yeah. So I go up and I'm like, all right, this is what we're looking for. We're looking for a book about humans fighting robots or aliens in space, but not too young. I'm just like, oh no, what's going to happen? And there are two librarians sitting there. I was closer to one talking to her, but there was another woman sitting at the other end of the desk. And that woman goes, oh, have you heard of this series? I'll find it and I'll put it in the show notes. And I was like, I have not. Let's look for that. And so the other librarian was looking it up to see if they had it at that branch. And while she was looking it up, I said, Go, why don't you go and look in the kids section to see if anything interests you? And he's like, no, I don't like kids books. And I'm like, Go, on the outside of the section is all of the readers for older kids. So like, if you go, that's going to have what you want. And so he stomps over and in a second comes back and is like, you lied. It doesn't have any of the kinds of books I want. I'm like, all right. So I asked the librarian, I'm like, do we have time? Can we go over there? And she's like, go. And so I walk over and I kneel down and I'm like, well, you have to look through. And then 1 second later, he had found a book about like an explorer academy going on an underwater adventure. So he was like, oh, I want this. And then the librarian came over and found one of the books in the series that the other woman had been talking about. Mm-hmm. He loved the look of that. It had like a flying car in space on the cover. So he's like, sold, took this, found something else he wanted. We go and check them out. He's reading them in the car. Reader's now obsessed with Boba. Yeah, he doesn't
wait until he gets home. Yeah.
No. Reader's obsessed with Boba. So we had to go. The other way I got them out of the house was to promise stopping for Boba on the way back. It's great. So we were on the way there. Go was reading the book. And he's like, oh, this is about a kid on vacation on the moon. And he gets attacked by aliens. And I was just like, librarians? How? Yeah. How do you do it?
Yeah.
I mean, what are the chances?
It's the same with record stores, you know?
Yeah.
Like when you have somebody who curates a body of information, then you can go and you can trust them with your preferences. You should be able to, at least. That is such a charming story.
It was pretty magical.
Yeah, he's a piece of work, that one.
He really is. For our first topic, I actually want to revisit the last episode we recorded.
Cool.
So I had a real internal battle because I edited the section about sex ed. And I deeply wanted to re-record, like so deeply wanted to re-record, because after we recorded it, I realized that it was a little bit more confused than I wanted it to be. Because what I think we should have done is sort of broken it down into what we want to talk about as parents, and then also about how to look at sex ed in the schools. And it was all kind of a jumble. But I didn't, because I liked some of the stuff we talked about it. I hope you guys found it interesting on one level or another. But thinking about it that way, it didn't make me realize that we'd missed a few things that maybe we should have touched on. So I'm just like doing it in two parts and whatever. So the first thing I wanted to very quickly address is when we were talking about talking with Go and how people end up having children.
Mm-hmm.
I realized in listening that it really sounds like the way I presented adoption as like the thing you do when all else fails.
Mm-hmm.
And that made me realize
It's not.
I should probably be more careful about how I talk to Go about it. It sort of comes up that way because I think right now Go's thinking about it very much in like how he would have a biological child.
Yes.
But I just wanted to say, for anybody who has adopted or is an adoptee, like that is not the way I look at it. And actually, we were very lucky in that we knew we might have fertility issues going in.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's one of the reasons we got through that so well as a couple is I had some surgeries and health issues where I knew I might have trouble conceiving. And so that was always on the table for me. And even before I knew I might have to adopt, I've been fascinated with adoption from a young age. I had a good friend who was adopted. I've read a lot of stories from adoptees. I think I have a lot of complex thoughts about adoptions. I know how difficult that has been for some adoptees, but I don't look at that as a last resort. I would love to foster at some point. I don't know if that'll ever happen for us. I have like a wild plan that I think I really hope we do get to put in place to potentially help kids aging out of the foster system. But I just wanted to say that I don't view that as secondary. I view that as a very special way to bring children into a family that has a lot of really interesting elements to it. And I didn't want anybody to think otherwise from the way I described it, because I felt real uncomfortable editing that, given how much I care about it as a topic. So just want to say that it's something I'd love to talk about later. I'm really fascinated by how religious communities really push for adoption and fostering in ways that I think are both wonderful and really unhealthy. And it's something I'd love to dig into at some point. So just putting that out there.
Okay.
But more specifically, going back to what I was talking about, I am curious because I think how parents talk to their kids about sex and then what sex ed does in the schools are actually two very particular things. And I'm just wondering, beyond the brass tacks, is there anything that you really care about teaching the boys sort of in the world of sex ed that you think the schools either won't do or won't do the way you want it to be covered?
I would just have to see the materials that the district would be using, honestly, because it varies so widely. Like, I don't know how to predict that. Some schools would do it better than others invariably. And so long as it's like some confluence of accurate science and medicine and practicing empathy and sound psychological schooling, that's all that really matters. So they're responsible with themselves and with other people.
Yeah.
So, but I would just have to see what it is they're being taught before I make some sort of determination. Obviously, like, given how we talk about these things, I personally wouldn't mind supporting them if their school experience isn't as robust as we would like it to be. But I'm perfectly happy letting the school take the lead on it if, they have a good program. So.
Yeah. I think based on my experience looking at a lot of materials, one thing I'm sort of particularly conscious of is that having young men, a lot of sort of popular culture paints young boys as always being the ones seeking sex and wanting sex.
Yep.
And young women always sort of being the gatekeepers to that.
Mm-hmm.
And I definitely plan to talk to them about how
it's not necessarily the case.
That's not necessarily the case, and that there's nothing wrong if they're the ones who want to wait. Mm-hmm. And also sort of, we talked a little bit about pleasure. I think there's a way to frame waiting that you will actually have better sex if you wait until a point where you're sort of more emotionally ready for it and ready to communicate better. So that's one thing I definitely want to make sure we talk about. And then I'm really definitely not when I was in school. I'm curious how curriculums are dealing with it now. I think I'd also just want to talk about like how hard communication can be around sex. There is, and this kind of plays into consent too. But I want to shout out, there's a podcast called The Heart, and it's made by Mermaid Palace. And podcast, the woman who makes it, her name is Caitlin Prest. And some of her stuff I find so challenging, but she did a whole season on consent that I actually saved because I was like, if I have kids, I think it was even before, maybe the boys are really young. I don't know, but it was like a long time ago. But I was like, if I have kids or when the kids are older, I want them to hear this, because she had actually recorded a night when she was with a man and he more or less pressured her into having sex, where she has it on audio. And you can hear her saying no. But, like as women, it can be very hard and scary to aggressively say no to a man. And so she does, like, you should always listen to no. But like the tone of her voice is so accommodating that it is this very complex situation where like she truly meant no, but I could see a man hearing it and thinking maybe she didn't mean it because it was trying to be so accommodating. And I was like, I desperately want my sons to hear this so they know that just because a woman is being nice, the no still means no. And you have to listen to the actual words. And also that if it's like a no one night, if the person really likes you, like it can easily turn into a yes in the future when that person is ready. And so, and just that like when you're young and starting out, like the talking can be so hard. I think we make it seem like it's easy and it's actually so difficult. So that's another thing that I'm not quite sure how schools are covering. And I would really want to make sure we talk about some.
Interesting. Yeah, for sure.
On the school front, like, is there anything you're worried about schools potentially teaching badly or like not teaching it how you'd want or having to do, like having to make some corrections?
Not necessarily corrections, but, we were talking months ago about teaching bias and context in history and teaching about the laws of logic and all that sort of stuff. That's the sort of thing that I would supplement. But it just depends on what the school's teaching.
Yeah. For me, probably my biggest concerns would be schools not covering topics that might be seen as only applicable to LGBTQ students. So
Okay.
I think everybody should know about the existence of PrEP. Like that's something that's very common in the gay community. It's a drug you can take where if you're with a partner that has HIV, it makes it very unlikely that you will get it as well. And I feel like that's something that like everybody should know about, because who knows where life is going to take different people and who they're going to want to have as their partner. Also, I think, just depending where we wind up and what school system the boys end up being into, just being very conscious of like what sort of extra messages schools end up sending with their materials. I know in a lot of school districts, they're still doing lessons that push very hard for abstinence and not having sex until marriage. And that can be like just unhelpful to
damaging.
Because some
that
of the
would
way
be an example of something that I would step in and talk to the boys about. For instance, if we're looking for potentials, that would be a big red flag.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard about curriculum that actually does exercises. Like they'll take a rose and pass it around and have like each kid manhandle the rose. So by the end, it's like falling apart and the petals are falling off and it looks disgusting, sort of to be like, well, if you have too many partners, this is who you'll be when you finally meet the person you want to spend the rest of your life with. And just terrible things that sort of suggest that having sex before you find the one, which I don't even believe is a thing, is somehow going to make you less than if you had waited. And I think that's like bad on multiple layers. Like in an ideal world, if you have had healthy relationships, those don't make you less. They make you more. Like they teach you things about yourself.
Yeah.
And
they make you a more suitable partner.
Yeah, exactly. They make you better at having relationships. They make you learn more about what you want out of a relationship. Mm-hmm. They give you experiences. They like, if you have had good relationships that have treated you well, you are going to come out of those a better person than you went in. And then on the other hand, like particularly for kids, like if you have had a bad relationship or if you have been abused or molested, like that also doesn't make you a bad person. Mm-hmm. And it also does not make you less than. Like that is a terrible thing that should not have happened to you, but it doesn't make you a dirty person. It doesn't, you know what I mean? Like mm-hmm. on either end, it's just a terrible message. So yeah, so I would be really concerned about anything like that. Yeah. And then I think it comes back to the other thing of just anything that presents, gender stereotypes too strongly, where it paints men as always having sort of one role in these kind of relationships and women having another.
Mm-hmm. No, those are all good points. I think that it's so hard being a parent in this day and age because you both have children with an easy access to huge volumes of information that we weren't privy to when we were kids. But also school systems that in more conservative areas are reacting so regressively mm-hmm. In light of kids having access to this information that the shaping of their minds in school on a day-to-day basis it actually like is impacted through the curriculum and through the methods that are used. And I'm not just talking about like religious indoctrination, but the tangential side of that when it comes to abstinence and evolution and climate change and cosmology and cosmogony. And I want my kids to learn what can be demonstrated and then repeated, things that they can on their own investigate and come to the same conclusions. That's it. Anything else needs to be framed as a hypothesis or anecdotal. And they could take from that what they will, but they need to have some sort of baseline of demonstrable information that they can lean on for guidance. Something more objective than just, teacher says a thing. And some districts will be better at that than others, I think. And some states are clearly better at it than others.
I would say, I feel like we've been pretty one, the boys have had wonderful teachers. So we've been in a position where we can really kind of trust that what's going on is good. But even in a great school district, the sex ed curriculum is one thing where I think, and look, Reader does not talk to us about what goes on at school. So no shame if your kids aren't, I'm not there's no shame in saying if your kids don't talk to you, some kids don't talk about what goes on at school. I think sex ed is one area where if you can dig into what's going to be taught, even if you love the school and the teachers, it might be good to know what's going to be taught.
Yeah.
If you can get a hold of that curriculum.
That's a good point.
I mean, conservative parents are doing this in horrible ways to keep legitimate scientific knowledge out of the curriculum. But I think there's some room on the other side to make sure that there's, and it doesn't, I think there's it's a super cool area to get involved and try to influence what's going on in the classroom, but to at least know what you might want to have a conversation about outside of that. It could be a useful thing. Because even the best meaning stuff can get real weird. Real weird. This actually makes me think of, I have a bridging topic to the next thing we're going to talk about.
Okay.
So our next topic kind of came out of our intro, which is about how society misrepresents families like ours. And leading up to talking about it, I was trying to look for some more concrete examples. And I've sort of kept following one of the, I don't even like to call her a trad wife. I don't think it's a good description of her at all, but one of the Christian mom influencers who I've been following, because she does YouTube videos with her husband. And I was curious if they had ever kind of talked about atheists in any way. And what I found was actually when they were younger, they did a sit down with an atheist couple where they both gave marriage advice.
Okay.
And I have no examples from it because it was actually a completely wonderful, respectful conversation. It was very impressive. And so no examples of misrepresentation there. But one thing they talked about was sex before marriage, because obviously it was a point that they deeply diverged from each other on. Mm-hmm. And the atheist couple said sort of all the things I would say about, you want to make sure that you're compatible on that point and, before getting married. And from the Christian side, Morgan had I don't think it's right, but I was this is more interesting than I thought you were going to say. She said, you're getting married and you're in it for the long haul. So if you're not compatible, you have the rest of your lives to work on it and work it out. And I think that doesn't fully work because I think there are levels of incompatibility that sort of aren't work outable.
No.
Unfortunately.
No.
When it comes to sex. So I don't think that
it's really naive.
It's very naive, but it was naive in an...
Oh, no, she's really optimistic. I love that pull up the bootstraps mentality.
Yeah,
that's great.
But there was an exploratory... Yeah, it doesn't work, but I liked that there was a level of exploration and almost fun suggested. Sure. That to me is not what I necessarily would assumed would have been their first response. So not right, but as far as a Christian response, I sort of felt A for effort, and I did like the vibe. Even if it's not accurate for a lot of people. But yeah, but let's talk about it. So I am curious, is there a first time where you remember people talking about atheists where you were Oh, that is not accurate at all.
It wasn't, because the thing is that I didn't really start to view myself as an atheist until after I had already kind of fallen headfirst into a lot of the atheist and humanist content on YouTube,
Mm-hmm.
specifically like call-in shows and such. And so it wasn't until I started seeing, and I don't want to paint all religious folks, with the same brushes, some of these callers, but these callers sometimes would be really vitriolic and really incendiary and really spiteful about any degree of secularism. And and I didn't really feel othered until I started hearing them say those things in that way. And since then there have been like movies like God's Not Dead with Kevin Sorbo. Oh my gosh, if you haven't seen this, you should see it, and like see it with a friend or a spouse and make a drinking game out of it, because there is so much bad faith argumentation and horrible straw manning and misrepresentation that it borders on self-parody. In fact, like, yeah, you kind of have to look at it as a parody because they take it so seriously, the filmmakers, that it's hard when you're not within the in-group of the target audience to take it seriously at all. It is so reprehensible. But just the other day, I saw somebody talking, like doing a critique of an interview that famed self-help guru Tony Robbins did, where he got to talking about how how much he discredits atheism, and how it wasn't even bordering on, he was actually like belittling the secularism and atheists. And just, it made me think that we are in an increasingly secularized society, but that certain segment of the population that feels threatened by secularization will be increasingly vocal in protest. I mean, and you understand why. Like, it's human nature. I get it.
Yeah.
But they are our neighbors, and we coexist. And one of the reasons why I've settled on humanism as far as a worldview is because we coexist, and that there has to be some sort of baseline that we all strive toward that helps everybody and helps the species continue. And cooperation is a part of that. And it doesn't foster cooperation when you are a respected talking head, essentially othering an increasingly large segment of the population based on an emotional appeal and not some sort of like logical necessity. And Oprah's done it. Steve Harvey's done it.
Mm-hmm.
You have, you don't even have to go to the Ben Shapiro's of the world. I'm just talking about people that other people might look up to, who aren't necessarily, supposed to be these political pundits or, any sort of scholarly or critical pursuit, where they're just famous people who've made a killing doing what they're doing, speaking their mind about a thing. And it's not helpful, because as much as I would like to see a world wherein we as secular folks can be left alone, and whereas we help enshrine legislation that allows for other people to worship whatever they want to worship, so long as it doesn't also give blanket approval to actions in support of that worship that infringe on other people's humanist rights. Like, I don't want to live in a society that normalizes that sort of behavior. And when somebody like as big as Tony Robbins gets up there and starts saying these things, everybody who like enjoys his work or supports him is perhaps more likely to hear what he has to say. And if they're on the fence or they're deconstructing or whatever, like that can hurt that person's relationships with other secular folks in their orbit. And that's what it comes down to, like having humanism as a baseline is for me important, but I know that not everybody, not even every atheist or secular person will. But there has to be some sort of metric that we use as individuals that lets us look at like the Steve Harveys of the world and say, okay, you know, when he's talking about, like, I'll see if I can pull up a quote in a second when you do your bit, when he says the things he says about secular folks, that you have to say like, no, we have to push back against that. Like, we can't take that sitting down, because that emboldens people who might not know better to be crappy towards a lot of people. You know, like that's not a useful tool rhetorically.
Yeah. You brought up Oprah. That was a watershed moment for me.
Yeah.
Truly.
She was real disappointing.
Because, like I've said before, you can go back to our episode about getting over a fear of hell. I've always been an atheist, but there was sort of a key moment that I realized I was an atheist. And it was pretty soon after that, maybe. I don't know what year it was, but I would watch Oprah after school, and I was watching when it happened. She was talking to a woman in the audience. Something came up where the woman felt like she needed to identify as an atheist and said, oh, you know, but I'm an atheist. And without missing a beat, Oprah said, I don't believe atheists exist. It was the most, I mean, it just denied this woman her entire experience of the universe. In a way, it wasn't like she was saying anything negative about atheists. It was just completely, it just amazed me that someone couldn't even wrap their minds around the fact that somebody would hold that position. And I think, you know, I don't, like, we do this podcast anonymously, right? So, like, I'm not going to say anything about anybody who doesn't want to publicly say that they're an atheist in their, you know, work life or with their family or with anything else. But I am always amazed at the number of relatively secular liberal people that I meet that still respond with absolute shock when I say that I'm an atheist. I think it's just something people don't hear a lot. As many people as there are who aren't actively religious, I think a lot of people don't actively identify, which is fine. But I do think it creates an interesting situation. There was one day I was just hanging out with the boys. I think it was just the three of us. I don't know if you were doing something or if it was like a holiday or something weird, but I was eating lunch with the boys and somebody called my cell phone, and it was just this like nice old lady calling random people to talk about God. I was like, all right. And I said, and I think she wanted to send me a Bible or something. And I was like, I'm sorry, I'm not interested. I'm an atheist. And she was like, oh, I've never met an atheist before. Now, this is a woman just calling random numbers to talk about God. So you would think somebody secular at some point, might have said that to her. You know what I mean? Like, it's, or maybe
they just were like, you know, being nice to get her off the phone as quickly as possible.
Yeah, no, and I actually talked with her for a while. She was, we had an interesting conversation about end times, because she was somebody who's like, you can see all the end time things, you know, coming down, happening.
I should talk about the thing. No, I'm not going to talk about the thing.
Nah.
Okay,
But
fine. I had
I
another end
was,
times experience with a parent the other day.
yeah, I
Anyway,
mean, there are a lot of people out there. And I was like, at
yeah.
every point since Christianity came into being, people have thought it was the end times. And at a certain point, you have to wonder, is this really the time it's right? Or is it this a time where we're going to be wrong? Like literally every other time since the religion was invented.
Yeah.
So, but it was a fine conversation. She was a sweet woman. But yeah, and I think around the same time, I pulled up the quote. George H.W. Bush said in response to a question, "No, I don't know that atheists should be considered citizens, nor should they be considered patriots. This is one nation under God." So it's an interesting moment because I've been following more religious people than I have in a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like for most of the people I follow, the focus is really not on atheists at all. It is on more progressive Christians that aren't doing Christianity right. And
it's the culture war.
Yeah.
I think they've given up because, especially with apologetics, they've I think largely come to accept that they're not converting people with apologetics. It's just a defense mechanism for people who are already in the faith. It's just you know what I mean.
Maybe.
I don't think there's a there. They're just mad. They were mad at the gays, but they lost that one. Now they're mad at the trans. They're going to lose that one too. So who are they going to?
And in honesty, they were never trying to convert the gays. Those were both just convenient topics that were good cultural touch points.
They needed an enemy. I know.
Yeah,
I get it.
Exactly.
I get it.
So
it's any
the focus has
authoritarianism.
always. So maybe that's always been the focus. Is sort of
they're going to find somebody else after the trans folks get all the legitimacy that gay folks have now.
Yeah.
And it's just going to keep going on and on and on and on. And they'll just find something else. And eventually they'll just make themselves totally irrelevant because their in-group is going to be increasingly small.
But maybe it also comes back to the Oprah thing where it's a different, if you believe that atheists are lying to themselves or really believers or, you know what I mean? Like maybe there's no point in talking to them because you don't even see it as like a legitimate enough position.
Maybe.
I
mean, Steve Harvey calls them atheist. He calls atheists idiots and said that he doesn't like them and doesn't even want to talk to them.
Yeah.
Yeah. He says they have no moral compass, but then wasn't he found like guilty of like beating his wife or something?
I don't know if I would want to say that without double checking
I'm gonna, okay. I retract that for the moment. Continue.
But it's interesting. And if the boys do end up staying non-believers, it'll be interesting to see how the world feels to them in that way. As more and more people become secular without specifically identifying as atheist, knowing that we do very specifically identify as atheist, I wonder if that will feel like a broader community or not. I'm not sure. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do.
Like, if you very much know that you're a non-believer, does it make you feel welcome and included to know that there are other people who are non-believers, even if they choose not to talk about that or to specifically identify as it? Because I know to Christians, like, they believe the media is totally secular and is like drawing people into secularism.
Right.
But I don't know. I mean, I think it probably feels better than having everybody like spout Christianity, whether they believe it or not. It's certainly more of a positive landscape than that.
But it would just be an absence. Like, if nobody talks about religion anymore, we just talk about other stuff. We'll talk about Star Trek more. That would be my ideal circumstance. Everybody talks about Star Trek more. Oh, and Steve Harvey's ex-wife, not his current one, but his ex-wife, $60 million lawsuit, accused him of psychological torture.
Okay.
So
fair enough.
Quote unquote prolonged torture. Of course, he denies it.
Yeah. Torture is a strong word. Whew.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for doing the research.
You're welcome. I do the heavy lifting here.
Yeah. I don't know. Is it better if just nobody talks about it at all?
No,
or is it better if everybody talks openly
everybody
about
has to talk about it all the time? Now, I think we need to talk about it more. I think we need to talk about it constantly. I think that, it needs to not be made. It needs to not be taboo to talk about politics and religion. I think that having the Band-Aid constantly ripped off is what people need, because especially now that through the internet, we can exist in information silos, right? We can curate our echo chambers. We can ignore all the things that disagree with us and all those voices that would tear us down. And not like I want to tear down religion. I'm not necessarily an anti-theist. It's more that I just want for those anti-secularists to give us the same courtesy that I would give them if they would just leave us alone. I don't get mad at religious folk in general. I decry certain religious folks' actions, right? Like, I'm not like going out there and stumping against the freaking Quakers,
Yeah.
It's, I mean, like, it's more like, bombing an abortion clinic. That's not good. So let's avoid that. Or
well, honey, we're not going to have abortion clinics anymore. So, problem solved.
Yeah.
Sorry. I was just curious because I'm trying to think, are there, obviously we have our favorite, atheists who are atheists on the atheist chat shows and those kind of things. But can you think of anybody who is an outspoken non-believer in public discourse where that isn't their thing? The way you'll have famous movie stars who are very religious and speak about that openly. Right. Can you think of somebody where it's atheism isn't their thing? It's not what they're known for, but they are an outspoken non-believer who matters to you?
You know what? That's an interesting question.
Nobody comes to mind, which I think is intriguing. I'm not saying there aren't. I've definitely heard quotes from a couple celebrities, but there's I can't think of anybody important to me who would fall into that category.
Well, what I like isn't necessarily somebody coming out and saying, I am this thing. It is part of my identity. Mm-hmm. What I like, for instance, if you're going to ask for one, I like, even though I know he's quite religious, is Jim Carrey. Mm-hmm. But flip side, also because Jim Carrey approaches it from a humanist standpoint, from everything I've heard him talk about. Mm-hmm. But the other side of it would be on the more agnostic side would be Keanu Reeves.
Oh, that's a good one.
I think so.
Yeah.
And he puts his money where his mouth is. He says these things, but then he also gives millions and millions of dollars anonymously, or maybe not anonymously, but he doesn't publicize his donations. And, and I would also, in that same vein, I would also listen to Dave Grohl if he were to talk about religion. I don't think he's ever come out and said he is a religious person, but I just know that, the different things that he does when it comes to taking his time and effort to feeding people, for instance, is sort of rubber meets the road when it comes to humanism. And that's, again, what I care more about is the alignment of worldview and less the speaking of the religious stuff. Because we've said many times, there's too much at stake for us to curate our in-group. Our in-group needs to be absolutely freaking massive. And that means that we're going to ally ourselves with people who might differ with us on whether or not gods exist or where morality comes from, if it comes from anywhere, how the universe was created, what the name of God is, how many gods there are. What matters most, I think, is the humanist side of things, because that's what's going to get us out of, climate crisis and population issues and deforestation and food and clean water and clean energy and, early childhood education and social safety nets and all the things that we need to actually get to Gene Roddenberry's vision of what humanity can be as a unified species on a planet that we all share, moving forward as one culture with many facets into the great unknown of the universe.
I mean, definitely with you on like the biggest tent possible, but I also don't think it hurts to have people you can look to in that tent that identify the same way you do.
Sure. But again, like I find it hard beyond just the people that you would say, like off the top of your head. Because as strident as he is, like Ricky Gervais has helped a bit. Though he does get quoted a lot by the other side because he is so strident. I like Stephen Fry.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Brits, because Stephen Fry is really he's more intellectual than Gervais is, and he is wittier. And because he's older, I think he has a bit more gravitas. But no, I love reading Stephen Fry's thoughts about it. Just because he has such a great, like with Douglas Adams, he has such a great, that's another one, such a great view on like cosmic nihilism. The universe doesn't care. Somewhere out there, the Vogon constructor fleet is going to annihilate Earth to make way for an interstellar highway. And there's not a damn thing we can do about it. So, we should just appreciate each other on the humanist side and work together on the humanist side as best as we possibly can to affect the greatest possible change, the maximal outcome for all of us.
All right, let's wrap it up there.
Well, I started kind of like loopy from my cold medication, but I got going there a little bit on the soapbox at the end, so I'm sorry if I got a little long-winded, people.
No worries.
I'm sure you'll cut 90% of it in the editing booth.
Not 90.
85.
We need to thank Jonathan Zolbin and First Frame Music for the music for this podcast.
And that wraps up this episode of The Family Skeptical, where nothing is sacred except for our kids.
Just a heads up, I'm going to say something I said last time, but I cut it out of the last episode because it got too confused. So don't be like, but we already talked about this.